of you, and thank you for coming out from lunch to join us for this conversation, and welcome to our online audience. We are delighted you can be with us for an important conversation. Yes, in my backyard. Words that are not heard very often around the world. And I think very appropriate title for today's conversation. It is, in my home country of the US, it is sadly the one area of true bipartisan agreement in the United States is that affordable housing, which is my particular area, is a good thing as long as it's not anywhere near where I live. And as a result, there is a massive shortage of both qualitatively and quantitatively of housing that's affordable, and we really have a crisis. California, arguably one of the most liberal states in our country, takes not at NIMBY, the opposite, not in my backyard, to a new level. They have banana, build absolutely nothing anywhere near anything. And therefore they have the largest shortage of housing in the country and are staggeringly short. So we're going to talk about infrastructure more broadly. Housing is, I would actually argue, is infrastructure, but we're going to talk about infrastructure across energy, across the built environment, and what it takes to bring together the forces to make projects happen and make them happen faster, because we are in the midst of two enormous megatrends. We have climate change and we have rapid urbanization. We have become now an urbanized world for the first time in human history, and that trend is only accelerating. And when you layer climate on top of that, there's a real urgency in terms of how we have our large cities adapt to be able to handle not only their current populations, but their projected populations as well. So I love that we have a panel that represents multiple sectors, because complex problems require multi-sector solutions. And I'm thrilled to introduce Tia Gordon, is the co-founder and CEO of It's Electric in the United States. We have honored to have Secretary Paul Chan, who is the Finance Secretary for Hong Kong. So glad you could be with us. Ebru Özdemir is chair of the board of Limak Holding in Turkey. And we have Mark Rose, who is chair and CEO of Avison Young, a Canadian-based but global property management firm. And I thought we would start, Mark, with you to take the bigger picture. You serve in so many markets around the world, and that gives you a perspective. So as you think more broadly about what it takes to make infrastructure happen and how to array all the forces, any broader principles of sort of what has worked and not worked in terms of making things happen?
So let's take that infrastructure word and just add a couple more. So we're talking community, right? Housing is within a community, which is within a city, and it's tied to infrastructure. The other thing I'll just throw out there is sometimes we hear back that there are certain areas in the world that are doing just fine, and they are, right? If there's growth and there's commitment, if people are getting things done, and there are those around the world, but generally what we're talking about here is where usually the public and the private sector are not working in unison. So, you go back to California, LA's actually at least looking at adding additional housing onto existing housing, because density is a real problem, right? We are seeing that where cities come together and communities come together to discuss what their needs are and what their objectives are, and those might include either helping to push development along, permits, right? There's some places, the mayor will come out and hand you the permit, and there are other places you need about 4 years, until you receive it. Those are all costs, and those are contributing to the problem of how can we get a city or communities based on really a collective view and sets of objectives as you want those outcomes to be, because quite frankly, we need all of it. Yeah. And we do know that where it's worked, either private capital can lead if it makes sense and it pencils out. It's typically not, the majority of cases, but where you get communities, private sector and public sector working, in almost all cases, there's a very good outcome.
Thank you. Such a key principle there, and thank you for mentioning community. I think there's been so much buzz historically about public-private partnerships, and sometimes we would argue the last P, people, is not part of that equation, and I think that's really at the heart of today's conversation. Paul, as you look at it from the finance perspective, before this he was the Minister of Development, so you've seen it from both sides. Talk a little bit about it very practically. One of the most dense cities in the world. How do you think about getting these development projects, and how do you engage the community to get the support for the change?
Yeah. Well, Hong Kong is a small city in terms of geographic, 1,100 square kilometer, but we house 7 million people. So a lot of high-rise buildings, densely populated. And we are suffering double aging problem, aging population and aging building. Particularly those buildings built in the 50s, 60s. So we need to make room for new developments to provide better facilities and better living for our people. But to do this redevelopment is quite challenging. So what we have adopted is public-private partnership, but in the earlier stage, the government take a more proactive role in terms of getting the consent from the people to move forward in terms of urban renewal. Say, for example, we will gather together NGOs, typically involving social workers, who will be able to assist in the process in discussion with the tenants and the landlords, because their interests sometimes are conflicting. And these people some may demand staying in the same neighborhood. The other more willing to take money. Yep. And also in the process, we need to provide facilities. So what we try to do is a people-centric, planning-led in terms of the overall development, and then district-based, so that when we redevelop a particular area, not just individual buildings, but small communities, so as to provide better facilities. We find the process a little longer in the initial stage, but in fact more efficient, because subsequent implementation will be faster. Then after we get the site, we will tender out for the private developers to do it, to do the development. Yeah.
And I think, thank you for that, because it is, if you look at the math, public sector has a lot of money, but not enough money. If we don't bring private capital in, it's impossible. But the public sector plays such a critical role because it sets the enabling environment and creates the right incentives to make that development possible. Iruf, coming to you, you're on the private side working with and just completed a major infrastructure project. Talk about it from the private lens. How do you then work with both the community and the government to actually bring a big project to fruition?
Thank you for the question, because right now all our world of construction and infrastructure actually is discussing that. And yesterday we had a governors meeting, and it was said that only 0.5% of the projects are successful. Everybody's like shocked. Wow, 0.5% only? Because the end users are not happy, contractors are not happy, the designers are not happy, and the public is not happy. So there's something wrong going on. But at the same time, there's immense needs. in the developed countries, everything is getting old, all the infrastructure is very. And in the developing countries, the needs are immense. We need water, we need housing, we need electricity lines. So everything has to be built, especially like in Africa. Maybe millions of housing has to be built. But at the same time, we have goals like 2050, net zero, which means in the world, if you would like to reach this goal, then every building from now on has to be built in the standards or with carbon emissions, and they should also be affordable and sustainable housing from now on to be built. Actually, we have the technology, but the thing is now we have issues in the execution. We have to execute to make all the stakeholders happy. This is the challenge. We have just, as you said, completed a very big construction project. It's the longest span bridge in the world, in Turkey, in the Dardanelles, more than 4 kilometers. When we first went there, the public was like, they can't travel from one side to the other because it's a very windy area, and in winter, they can't even go to the hospitals. There's an immense need. But at the end of the day, this is like 100 kilometers of highway, 4 kilometers of a big structure, world's tallest towers and the immense amount. I mean, at one point there was like 10,000 people working. So the need is there, but to make everybody happy, especially in a country like Turkey, where we have a lot of villages, we started to consult with people. I mean, what do they need? And the counseling kept on, and then we identified 321 different projects we performed along the way, with the villagers especially. And one of the projects, like, we helped women to form a cooperation in agriculture. But the thing is, they don't know anything. I mean, we help them, we give them the capital, we help them to market, and we help them to produce at a scale. So this is one of the projects that we have done, and we won some awards in that, because in these kind of projects, when you start to build something from scratch, then you have to do it with all the community around you, and it's very important.
Thank you. It's, I loved your point about, you know, it goes back to the African proverb, if you shortcut the work at the front end on the process of pulling all the people together, it actually costs you later on, and we see projects that don't work. I have a cautionary version of that. If you think about Eastern Europe and the Soviet-era apartment blocks that were privatized en masse after the fall of the Soviet Union, privatization wasn't necessarily a bad idea, but privatization without creating homeowners associations and without any reserves meant that there was no process for maintaining any of those buildings, and they were wildly energy inefficient. So we started a process about 8-9 years ago that I think is a big idea, which would be, and it takes the subsidy is to create homeowners associations. Because right now the problem is if you're on the top floor and the roof leaks, you really care, but no one else cares. But if we create a homeowners association, what we have proven now in 5 countries is that we can then lend the money to the homeowners association to do energy retrofits of the building, and they can actually repay the loans out of the savings, because energy used to be free, now energy is really expensive, and so it's actually both a green solution but also dramatic improvement in quality of life.
Yeah, can I just make, just one comment? First of all, if everybody was equally unhappy, I think you had a very successful project.
What is happiness? Yes, at the end of the day.
Just one question: was the public sector involved with you from the very beginning?
It's a PPP. We raised the financing, but of course, I mean, to be able to build up this project, we need enormous amount of permissions. And also an employer is the Turkish Highways Authority. We were reporting to them, but all the design from scratch and the financing was done by us.
Thank you. Tia, I want to come to you because you're in New York City and you've come up with a new way of approaching a big roadblock to one of the most important energy transitions. Talk about what you're trying to do with chargers.
Sure. So I'm coming to you from New York City. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you to everyone on this panel. In the States, we say electrify everything. That's what the sort of mantra is right now. California has a mandate. 11 other states, at least, are now following it, where we're going to basically be banning the sale of new combustion engines by 2030. We're phasing things out up into 2035. So right now, what's happening is that we're all being pushed to drive electric vehicles, as we should, given the fact that we're a year away from our UN goal of capping all greenhouse gas emissions. Yet charging is the leading barrier for people to make this transition. So right now what's happening is there's an assumption that people will just figure it out, that most people will charge at home, and we're putting the responsibility on the onus of the individual. But what in actuality we need to do is we need to build that infrastructure. We like to say it's not chicken or egg, it's all egg. No one's going to be able to go out and make their next vehicle electric once they drive their internal combustion engine, per our earlier conversation, into the ground, if they can't see where they're going to charge. So tying in words that we're hearing on this stage is the idea of infrastructure. So everyone says, well, we can't put in new chargers because there's not adequate infrastructure. But we're talking about the sort of traditional comprehension of infrastructure. And so I founded a company called It's Electric, and what we do is we've kind of rethought what infrastructure is in a city. And the infrastructure is not necessarily the utility lines in the street. It is the power capacity in every single building. So every building has spare electrical capacity, which can be harnessed and used to power electric vehicles. So what we're proposing is a model to find ways to say yes in my backyard, because we are providing chargers that are free to cities, free to buildings. We use that power from the buildings, and then to help the buildings in this agreement, we then revenue share back with them. So we're bringing the ability for people to charge electric vehicles. We're helping cities meet their goals in terms of EV targets and EV charging targets. And then we're bringing the green of the green economy into communities so that they're seeing an actual fiscal benefit for having this infrastructure in their neighborhoods. Because otherwise what you have is charging only being deployed where there's high utilization, which means basically areas of high net worth. So you have this self-fulfilling prophecy where EVs are only going to be for a certain elite class as opposed to everyone. And just hearing from the CEO of Uber, who's here this week, they are working to bring the cost of EVs down. We have federal subsidies. We have all of these different incentives to where in 5 years, you will be able to purchase an EV as a low-cost economy car. It'll cost you less to run over your lifetime. It'll be a big benefit for you on a personal level as well as an environmental level, but you need to be able to charge it.
Thank you.
On the infrastructure, perhaps we can share one very unique model in Hong Kong in terms of building railways. Yeah, building railways, we have a mass transit corporation, which is basically handling all the railways, underground transportation infrastructure of Hong Kong. So the way we do it is to the extent possible, when they want to, when the city, I mean, in terms of the railway lines, the planning, of course, the government. Yeah, it has to be fitting into our overall transportation infrastructure planning. So after when we contemplate that and to build a railway line, we will discuss with the Mass Transit Railway Corporation. And they will welcome that because construction cost is expensive. Sometimes when you try to build up a particular community, the initial traffic may not be enough. You don't have enough population. So in terms of a discounted cash flow basis, what will be a deficit? The railway company won't be able to do that. So what we are trying to do is, along the railway line, on top of the station, or just adjacent to the station, we give them the property development rights. So that when they build this railway at the same time, they can go into partnership with private developers to develop those commercial plus residential premises. In this process, they will be able to make a profit. And that profit will go some way to address the deficit in the future cash flow. And also that will contribute to a certain extent some land premium to the government. And for the community, it is also very welcome because this is very convenient located apartment or commercial space, very much treasure. So by doing this, basically we are using the adjacent lands development right to finance the whole thing.
That's such a great example and actually hits a key principle, which is ideally if we're going to get to our carbon goals, we need, this idea of the 15-minute city. In order to do that, people have to live close to where they work. You've got to have transit-oriented development, and it's got to be mixed income, mixed use. And so I love the, in a sense, cross-subsidy by creating value with the rights. And I do think a lot of cities are looking at going above their transit systems as a way to create new value.
And also in the process, that gives us some flexibility. Say, for example, in that neighborhood, they may need some swimming pool, library, community center. If I want to do those projects, I have to prioritize it within the government long list of such projects. It would take years to have this completed. But when I asked the railway company to do the railway plus the development, if the mathematics are right, I could ask them to do also this, and within the overall budget.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
So the community goals get met. The math works. It's lowering actually the cost for the government,
Yeah,
and then
and
you're
more
getting
efficient.
taxed because you've got more development on that land.
And they have
For the housing, if you could put also the net zero goal, then you can also create, it's easier to achieve the targets.
Yeah, and the beauty of having this done by a private sector company is the flexibility and the speed. Yeah.
Which is, and I think we certainly see that in housing, which is the government is good at setting the table, but historically governments are not great at building housing. The private sector has been faster at actually doing the construction. Mark, circling back to you, have you seen, what other bright spots are there? Which cities do you see making progress on both, the sort of integrating the community, but being able to either do redevelopment or increase, build out their infrastructure?
Yeah, again, you'll see most cities in the UK are looking at this. They want to get things done. You look at Liverpool, who has added a knowledge corridor with a focus on infectious diseases. They chose, which sort of the recommendation and how we advise our clients every day on this is to come up with some discipline around what you want to achieve. So what are these outcomes for cities and communities? Obviously, you have to look at transportation. Look at Detroit. So we were part of, the forum's urban transformation, and, my colleague, Amy Tabari, was there, and it was pretty clear that people want to work together. And, when we're going to need incentives, you look at Detroit, that's a place that's done well. We're just not there yet. And we know we're not there yet because we know that not only do we have a low-income housing problem, we now have a very serious workforce housing problem that I'm hoping for all the wrong reasons that we get the politicians to understand that when teachers and policemen and nurses can't afford their homes, we have a crisis, right? Which, by the way, has been here for some time. So we can pick out, the success stories, but it's pretty wide that we need to get at this.
Absolutely. My hometown of Atlanta is actually finally taking housing seriously. They can't get transit right because they're broken into 5 different counties, none of whom can agree, and you really need a coordinated process. For everyone, Tia, what do you need from the government? I want to get to community, but when you think about trying to move forward, what's most helpful and what's least helpful as you try to partner with the regulatory side?
I think private sector has an ability to execute, definitely. I mean, if something has to be delivered, private sector can. We built this longest bridge in 4 years. We built Istanbul Airport in 4 years. I mean, it's massive. It's more than 300,000 meters square. So the idea is what we need from the government is the support, especially in the permission phases. I mean, because when you start to build something, then you have to take permissions or permits from different institutions and organizations. Like even in Turkey, you have to go to different ministries, Ministry of Forestry, Ministry of X, Y, Z. So there should be a coordination for us to perform these. But at the same time, I think if the goals are given to us, like affordable housing, net zero, the X, Y, Z, then we can deliver. And at the same time, when we were building bridge, I'm going to give the other example, we did the environmental impact assessment at the highest standards, at the EBRD standards. And the mammals were passing from Dardanelles, and we stopped construction when they were passing. I mean, there's a very certain type of shells living there. We collected each of them because the foundations were at the sea where they were living, and we carried out to a different place. So we need to be given the guidelines, and we can perform afterwards easily.
And Tia, does your world need a heavy play from the city?
Yeah, so I mean, when you think about what the need is, obviously funding, but then there's also permission. So let's look at funding. We're at a once-in-a-lifetime sort of inflection point in terms of funding that's being driven into climate based on the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, which from that we have NEVI, and NEVI is $7 billion dedicated to electric vehicle charging infrastructure in the United States. Of that 7.5, $5 billion is dedicated to that corridor charging, your highways, your rest stops. But then there's 2.5 discretionary, which is called the CFI fund, and this is specifically earmarked for urban and rural solutions. So the funding is there. This is, again, once in a lifetime to take advantage to put this infrastructure in the ground when we have a consensus on a state, federal, and city level of what needs to happen to meet these 2050 climate goals. And so that's fantastic. But then how do we not waste this opportunity? So all we need then on the local level is permission. And so to Mark's point earlier, let's not have permitting take 4 years. We don't have 4 years. What can we do to understand processes and to help streamline this? And that's also, again, coming to think about what is a long-term permit. So when we look at, again, tying it back to electric vehicles, creating an inter-utility connection and pulling that inter-utility permit is sometimes an 18-month process in some cities, right? But you do something simpler, a public right-of-way or revocable consent permit, that's a question of months. And you can kind of look at the ways to reframe the opportunity. And like we just say, like if the current infrastructure and processes don't work, then change the infrastructure and change the process.
And Tia, I'm going to add one more thing to that, because
Please.
if you don't have the permissions, or if the funders know that you will never get these permissions, or it's going to take 4 or 5 years, then they'll know funding. So basically, I mean, at the end of the day, what we do is we finance a contract.
Yeah.
And everybody has to believe that it's doable,
Right.
which means that, you know, the government or the municipalities are supporting you.
And speed is such a big piece because, you know, it's a huge tax on a project if you have uncertainty and if you have length of time. And it is, both of those are killers. And I think especially now with higher interest rates as well, it makes it almost impossible to pencil big projects. And so it's a big deal. How do you think then about the community side? And I think, Paul, you gave a very good example of that, but how getting that voice of the community so they become supporters of this change rather than actually resistance, creating resistance to the change?
Yeah, in the process of urban renewal, really multi-party. Even within the old areas, because of the tenant mix, the ownership, the interests are very different. So it is indeed very difficult for the government to deal with individual stakeholders. So what we have been trying to do is to bring in NGOs, and they have very experienced social workers. Of course, the social workers by nature will fight for those they believe to be underprivileged. That is good, but on the other hand, through this positive engagement, we also let them know the government, how we are going to help these people to relocate. Some of them may choose get some money and move to live with their kids. Some may insist to be relocated back. But in the meantime, don't put me too far away from the existing neighborhood. So these different demands really very difficult to address. So bringing in NGOs, social work teams, would become the intermediary between the government and the people. That helps a lot. And in the process, we also try to understand the community's needs as to, say, for example, education provision, primary schools, secondary schools, community facilities. So with all this, then it is easier for us to go through the town planning board to have the final permission. Then the execution part is comparatively easier. So that is how we go about to do the urban renewal. And in the process, we have set up a statutory body called the Urban Renewal Authority, taking it away from the government. Although as a statutory body, they, of course, follow the best governance. But on the other hand, they have certain flexibilities in terms of compensation policies, in terms of temporary provisions. Because for the government, a lot of real cost implications you need to evaluate. It takes time. So having the assistance of NGO, step board, social workers helps a lot in the process.
I do think that's the role civil society can play, and helpful. Sometimes it can be unhelpful, but I think it is how do you collect the voices of the community? You'll never get perfect consensus, but doing that deep work early so that you've got sufficient support in the community to make progress. It really looked like you had a comment on
May I
that.
add something to that? I mean, I think, you know, why we are not, why everyone is unhappy, or why the projects are assumed unsuccessful. Maybe during the course of construction, I mean, you create dust, you create road closures, you know, noise and annoying time during the construction. So I think this is one of the reasons why everybody is unhappy. And but the end, when they see the end product, they're happy. So I think that part, as the minister said, I mean, we have to really manage that time. This is the reason we had some consultation telephone lines. People call, they say that their complaint, and we try to sort these out in 30 days. So that, I mean, if somebody calls me and says that, okay, you just created this dirt or you created this noise there and this, then if we could address it at a certain time and if we deliver it, then they're happy. So this continuous, I think, engagement with the stakeholders is, I think, it's so vital.
That's really helpful. We are, in just a moment, going to take questions from all of you. So be thinking about your questions. I want to share just one example from very different contexts. We've been talking mostly about high dense and high income contexts, but I think these same principles cross over. I'm thinking about a project, long project we did with many partners in Bogota, where you had families living in informal settlements, and we have nearly 1 billion people living informally around the world now. These families had been living for 25 years in the hills outside Bogota, but really disconnected from the city and without the right to stay. And if you don't have the right to stay, the housing doesn't develop, the market doesn't develop. And so the city made a commitment, two really important commitments. One, bus rapid transit to increase access, and then actually building cable cars into the hills. So dramatically cutting the time to get from the other side was to reduce the number of steps for the families to formalize their ownership. And they didn't actually have to build the housing. By creating transportation and the right to stay, the market actually started developing because now people could sell their house, they could upgrade their house, they could obtain financing to do improvements. So you started to see a market get created because the enabling environment changed. And I think we did a study that showed there's enormous GDP opportunity by unleashing the power of informal settlements. And so we think that's a big opportunity. Comments, questions, I would ask you to keep them tight and short and take advantage of the expertise of our panel. We have a mic coming around.
Thank you. I'm Alexander Betts from the University of Oxford. I'm interested in any examples you've got of where there's political polarization in communities, where there's particularly sustainable urban planning and there are winners and losers, and that's inevitable. How do you overcome that and ensure losers can share in the benefits? So, for example, we've heard a lot about the links between sustainable urban planning and transport, concepts like 15-minute cities, linked to that, low traffic neighborhoods, EVs, often things that benefit gentrified areas, middle classes who value the environment, value low traffic, and use electric bicycles, etc. But there are perceived disadvantages for often communities left behind, whether they're real or perceived. How can you manage those conflicts and ensure that the people who feel left behind share in the benefits? Any good examples?
I'd be happy to start. So we advise all of our clients through a social value framework. And so we're taking into account energy and resources and circularity and DEI and any and everything that you can think about, in terms of what do communities and culture mean and how can we develop? Because again, inherent in what we're all saying here, affordability, cities, and the environment and the carbon situation are pretty well linked, okay? With a limited amount of management and a limited amount of capital to get them all done. So you ask the political question, I would say from my decades of experience, we can go in there. You want to work with people who actually want to get something done, right? That's first. You bring together and hopefully avoid having winners and losers, because as we said, the most successful has been bringing everybody together to come to some sort of consensus. You're never going to get consensus, right? So even the losers should win there. But you have to engage in dialogue, and you also have to know when you can't win. And this is something that just the respect for other people's opinions. There are residents who live in certain places, let's say that they are coal producing. You're not going to convince them. So why is all that energy being spent there when you can make so much progress with the public sector and the private sector that wants to get something done?
Yeah, if I may try to give another example. In Hong Kong, we suffer from shortage of housing. So a lot of people need to be accommodated in inadequate housing environment. So we want to build faster, build more, but we do not have land. So what we have contemplated is to do a study about Hong Kong in terms of identify sites for development, quicker one. And we identify some greenbelt sites. It is not country park, it is very close to infrastructure, but somehow previously got zoned as greenbelt sites. We want to develop it. Of course, for the people living in that neighborhood, some may raise objections because this affects the scenery. So in the process, not easy. We need the support of the public. So the engagement with the community locally is important. But at the same time, try to demonstrate the bigger picture and have the support from the broader community is also important. But not just that, but also in the process where before we go through the town planning board, we will talk to the local community as to what kind of facilities that we will be able to provide to a certain extent compensate their sacrifice of the green side. So by doing so, we may not be able to have complete consensus, but at least we have the support of the broader community. And in the process, hand on our heart, we will be able to provide the existing inhabitants with improved facilities. We try to move on similar to this basis.
Quick one as well. So political polarization obviously is very much tied to climate. And so how do you overcome bias that's aligned to political party when you're trying to solve for this crisis? And for me, what I would say is that the bottom line is the economic bottom line. So there's just a report that was released of EV ownership by state, and of course, no surprises in the United States, California led by a wide margin, given their sort of more progressive policies. But then I believe the second or third largest state for EV ownership was Florida. So it's like, I call it their dark green secret. Because obviously, there's a big sort of optic lens of Republican power there, which is a message that is not necessarily pro-environment in a lot of the cases. So what people of Florida, what people have discovered is that, to fuel an electric vehicle, quote unquote fuel, you're looking at, charging a battery at home for about $18 as opposed to going to the gas station for $85. And so if you can just sell people on the economics, then you can sell climate.
That's great. It's an interesting broad case study, which you may be very familiar, is looking at the Hope 6 programs under the Clinton administration and which ones worked and didn't. And it was heavily driven off, in some ways, how well they dealt with those local council members and rallied community support. But I've got some positive examples I can take offline. We have a question in the front.
Yes, so I was mayor of a small city in California, one of those banana communities, as you referred to. And when I was elected, I was on the side of needing affordable housing. That's why I ran. I had grown up in the community. I now was trying to move back there with my daughter and just simply couldn't afford it. One of the major issues that we came up against and that I saw time and time again as I was talking to, colleague mayors across the country was the stigma of people who need affordable housing. There's so much stigma around poverty still. And oftentimes when you start using the word affordable housing, the gut reaction, even from Democrats, the gut reaction was, oh, those people, right? And they have a very negative image in their minds. In fact, the only way we were able to start an impact fund for affordable housing based on impact fee that we were charging people for new construction, the only way we got there was years of reframing the issue as workforce housing and bringing out our firemen and bringing out our teachers that were commuting for 2 hours, per day, and the grocery store clerks. So it was sort of taking away from the stigma and the perception that would be somebody scary. Where do you guys see? Do you see any of these larger communications sort of plans to reframe the issue in one that might be more palatable to people? And do you think that would make a difference in bigger cities as well?
Thanks for the question. I may jump in a little bit because this is what we live with all the time. I do think affordable housing as a brand is terrible. It's broken. People think of in the United States context of the 1950s housing projects and all of the, now you talk about housing affordability, it's a small change, but actually at all incomes levels, we want to have housing that is affordable. And I do think workforce plays much better, absolutely. And some of it's education. I mean, honestly, we engage about 1 million volunteers a year, not because that's the most efficient way to build houses, but because that's a way you actually create relationships across socioeconomic class, which starts then to break down those stereotypes. because we've become so economically segregated, people don't have meaningful relationships. There's two sides that are bad to that. One side is both a human loss, but you get political resistance. The other side of it is social mobility doesn't happen when we concentrate poverty. And so it is mixed income communities have dramatically better outcomes for everyone, not just for the low-income families. But we've increasingly not organized ourselves this way, but would welcome perspectives on that.
Well, we said it earlier, and I think the politics of it is to reframe it. As we said, I do think the politicians get a little scared when you do say a teacher can't find an affordable place to live. And so maybe we do come back, to reframe it, to recast. To cut to the chase, you just look at the situations with homeless. Wouldn't it be better if they were in homes that we can help with? Because you're complaining about that too, right? And so we unfortunately in U.S. we are a bit divisive at the moment, and hopefully these things are going to get better, but you have to address them, you have to take them on, you have to have people of courage, and then along the way you do need the marketing that we can maybe sell something, as I said earlier, this exact issue that you brought up, maybe we can get it done for the wrong reason. Right? By focusing them on these people that we look at going, they shouldn't have a problem, and still wind up dealing with a housing crisis that we need for everybody. So it's a possible outcome.
For us, maybe less of a stigma problem, in a sense that, housing is very expensive in Hong Kong, small, tiny metropolitan city. So about slightly more than 1/3 of our population living in public rental housing, built by the government. Yeah. Another 12% live in subsidized sale flat, sold to them at a substantial discount. So altogether, about 47% of our total population. I grew up from one of those public rental housing myself. The rest in the private area, 2/3 are homeowners, 1/3 are rental. We have been building those public rental housing and subsidized flat for sale of very high quality, with very good facilities. So even some of them, when you compare to the smaller private development, may be better in overall terms. So that stigma perhaps less serious in our situation.
Yeah, just add one more thing. I think it's
Very
a perception
quick, 'cause
issue. It's a
taking our
perception
time.
issue. In Turkey, we don't have that, and the Turkish government is building all over Turkey very good quality housing, and they just offer them at interest-free and at good prices, and it's very, very, very much welcome, especially by the civil servants. It's a perception.
That's a cultural piece. We are rapidly coming out of time. Just a few highlights we heard. One, critical aspect, it's got to be multi-sector, that no sector can solve these issues by themselves. Two, the critical role government plays in terms of if we can make it faster and easier to build, what a difference that makes for the private sector, who can then attract the capital to make projects really happen. And then the creativity, and a way to break through if we can find third ways to meet our carbon goals without sacrificing the human goals in terms of what communities in need. Please help me thank Mark Abreu, Secretary Paul, and Tia, and I want to hand it to Jeff Merritt, who leads the urban transformation work for the WEF, to close us out.
Thank you, Jonathan, and all the panelists. I think as we heard here, it's really about coming together across industries, across sectors.
Yeah.
A year ago this week, we came together here in Davos, and we created something, Mark, you were there, called the Davos Couture Alliance. And we had over 30 different governments from around the world coming together with private sector, civil society, really define a vision for more vibrant communities. And what you find is when you sort of focus on the things that we all believe in, the fact that our communities should be livable, they should be places that we want to raise our kids, that are healthy and safe, that we all have so much more in common than we have differences. And interestingly, also last year at this time, we kicked off an effort with some of our partners to say, what would it look like if we all started to rally around one place? And the place that we chose is actually my hometown now, San Francisco, a city that has been challenged very much post-pandemic. And we said, okay, can we all come together and help to revitalize our downtown around a vision of a cleaner, safer, more inclusive downtown? And what I can tell you now is, and Tia's part of this effort, we're bringing innovators from around the world there, and really quickly we have a coalition across different types of companies and institutions working together with the local community there to help create good, hard-working jobs and bring people back downtown. So I really believe where there's a will, there is a way, and I invite you all to join us on this effort. If you want to learn more about the Davos Couture Alliance, you can go to the website, which is davosalliance.org. If you want to learn more about this Alliance for Urban Innovation that Tia is a part of and the work we're doing in San Francisco, the website for that is wef.ch/urban innovation. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you all for all the work we're going to do ahead.
Thank you.